The city of Merv had a population of roughly 700,000 people, one of the largest, wealthiest, most sophisticated urban centers on Earth. Libraries, gardens, scholars, merchants from 3 continents moving through its streets. And then the Mongols arrived. What happened next took less than a week. But here's the thing. This isn't a story about death. Death was almost the merciful outcome. What the Mongol war machine had truly perfected across decades of conquest stretching from the Pacific coast to the gates of Europe was something far more calculated than killing. It was a system, a deliberate, engineered process that turned human beings into tools, symbols, and weapons. And if you happened to be skilled, royal, or simply unlucky enough to be standing in the wrong city when the siege walls went up, your fate was determined before you ever saw a Mongol soldier. This is the part nobody puts in the textbooks. Let me take you back. It's 1221. The Mongol general Tolui, youngest son of Genghis Khan himself, has just received the surrender of Merv. The city's governor, terrified, negotiated terms. He walked out with promises of mercy. The citizens were told to gather in the fields outside the city walls, unarmed, organized, cooperative. And for 3 days, Mongol soldiers moved through that assembled crowd with a quiet, methodical efficiency that eyewitnesses described as almost administrative. Each soldier was reportedly assigned a quota of 300 to 400 people. They worked through it like a task. But here's where it gets darker. Not everyone died. That was intentional. A specific category of people were separated before the slaughter began. Artisans, engineers, craftsmen, physicians, anyone whose hands carried skills the Mongol Empire could use. They were pulled aside, bound, and marched east. These weren't prisoners of war in any traditional sense. They weren't ransomed. They weren't eventually freed. They were absorbed permanently into the Mongol military-industrial machine. Weavers made armor. Blacksmiths made siege weapons. Doctors kept Mongol commanders alive. Their expertise became Mongol expertise. Their knowledge became Mongol knowledge. And the moment their skills became obsolete, their protection evaporated with it. Now here's the hidden system nobody really talks about. The Mongols had a classification system for prisoners, not written down in a legal code the way the Romans formalized things. The Mongols were pragmatists, not lawyers, but just as rigid in practice. Prisoners fell into roughly 4 categories, and where you landed determined everything. The skilled artisans went east to serve the empire. Common soldiers and able-bodied men were often conscripted directly into the next siege, forced to march at the front of Mongol assaults against their own neighboring cities, carrying ladders, filling moats, absorbing the first arrows so Mongol soldiers didn't have to. The Mongols called these forces hashar, human infrastructure, expendable human infrastructure. A third category, women of high status, daughters of rulers, wives of commanders. They entered the Mongol court system as wives, concubines, or servants to powerful families. And a fourth category existed that was perhaps the most psychologically brutal of all. The survivors deliberately left alive and sent back. That last category requires explanation. The man had built an elaborate silver tree that dispensed wine and fermented mare's milk from Mongol feasts. He was skilled enough to be kept comfortable. He was also, notably, unable to leave. Now, let me tell you about what happened to the ones who weren't skilled. The hashar, those conscripted soldiers, faced something uniquely terrible. They were used as the first wave in siege operations. At the city of Zhengdu in 1215, at Shenyang, at dozens of fortified cities across Central Asia and China, Mongol commanders placed captive soldiers at the literal front of assault formations. These men were given rudimentary weapons and ordered forward. The defenders on the walls faced an impossible choice: kill people who may have been their countrymen, their neighbors, their former soldiers, or hold fire and allow the assault to reach the walls. The Mongols understood this psychology precisely. They were using human suffering as a tactical instrument. If the captive soldiers survived the assault, which many didn't, there was no promotion, no recognition, no freedom. They remained in the column, used again at the next city, This is where it reveals something about power that goes beyond any single empire. The Mongol system worked because it converted every conquest into fuel for the next conquest. Captured engineers made better siege weapons. Captured soldiers absorbed enemy arrows. Captured administrators ran occupied territories. Captured women produced children who grew up Mongol. The empire didn't just defeat its enemies, it metabolized them, incorporated them. The very people who had resisted became the mechanism of the next expansion. And here's the thing about Genghis Khan himself that historians still argue about. He wasn't indiscriminate. That's the uncomfortable truth. The massacres, and they were real, catastrophic, and deliberate, were policy decisions, not rampages. Cities that surrendered without resistance were typically spared mass killing and given governance under Mongol oversight. Cities that resisted, even cities that surrendered after a prolonged siege, faced systematic destruction as a message to every remaining unconquered settlement. Genghis understood that the reputation of total annihilation was worth more than the act itself. Fear was cheaper than soldiers. Terror was a force multiplier. The city of Urgench resisted. The Mongols diverted a river to flood it. The city of Nishapur resisted after a Mongol commander was killed there. The ensuing destruction was so total that Persian accounts describe soldiers being ordered to ensure nothing, not even cats or dogs, survived as a witness to what the city had been. Skulls were arranged in pyramids, not from bloodlust, though there was certainly that, from message sending, from an understanding that the ancient world moved at the speed of rumor, and the most terrifying rumor you could send ahead of your army was a true one. For the prisoners who survived all of this, the artisans in Karakoram, the Hashar who lived through a dozen sieges, the women absorbed into the court system, life continued in a form that bore almost no relationship to what it had been before. Identity dissolved. Language dissolved. The Persian craftsman became a Mongol craftsman. The Chinese engineer built weapons for the rulers who had destroyed his country. Over generations, the absorbed populations became part of the empire itself. Their descendants sometimes rose to positions of genuine power. The Mongol Empire was, paradoxically, one of the most cosmopolitan political structures in the medieval world, staffed at every level by the descendants of people it had conquered. That's the layer that's hardest to sit with. The walls of Merv don't stand today the way the Mamertine prison stands in Rome. The cities were too thoroughly destroyed, the centuries too erosive. But the records survive. Juvayni's accounts, Marco Polo's observations, the letters of William of Rubruck, the chronicles of Chinese historians who watched the Jin dynasty collapse, they all document the same system, described from different angles, in different languages across different decades. What this really tells us isn't just about the Mongols. It tells us about the logic of absolute power when it operates without restraint. The classification of human beings by utility, the weaponization of terror, the conversion of conquered people into instruments of further conquest. The Mongols didn't invent these practices. Rome did similar things with different aesthetics. Later empires would refine and repeat the same patterns. But no empire in history executed this system at such scale, with such speed, across such geography, in such a compressed window of time. At its peak, the Mongol Empire covered 24 million square kilometers, more than any land empire before or since. Every kilometer of it was built, at least in part, on the labor, the suffering, and the absorbed expertise of people who never chose to be part of it. The silver tree in Karakoram poured wine from Mongol feasts. The man who built it was from Paris. He hadn't left voluntarily. That detail, small as it is, contains the whole story.